This story is a work of historical crime fiction and horror, inspired by true crime tropes and fictionalized elements. The characters, events, and locations described are partly or entirely fictionalized for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. The aim of this narrative is entertainment and exploration of psychological horror, not to glorify violence or criminal behavior. Listener discretion is strongly advised due to mature themes, including death, crime, and psychological manipulation. Ruth Holloway was a woman who seemed born to attract attention, even when she did nothing to seek it. She lived in Hollow Creek, a small, fog-draped town where the same faces lingered for generations, and gossip moved faster than the trains that passed its station. At 43 years old, Ruth had already lived through more funerals than most would see in a lifetime, and not just any funerals, but those of her own husbands. Her neighbors whispered about her with both pity and suspicion. To some, Ruth was a tragic figure, cursed with the kind of misfortune only found in Gothic novels. Every man she loved taken too soon, as if death itself courted her more fiercely than the living. To others, she was something more sinister, a spider weaving a quiet web, patiently watching as men walked willingly into her trap. The beauty that never faded Ruth was not the kind of beauty that shone brightly in youth and faded with time. Instead, she carried a strange elegance that seemed to sharpen as she aged. Her auburn hair, always styled immaculately, contrasted with her pale, almost porcelain skin. Her green eyes had a way of lingering on people, just long enough to make them feel both admired and exposed. Men often described her as enchanting. Women, less generously, called her dangerous. But no one denied her presence was magnetic. At church, she sat in the front pew, her posture perfect, her voice soft when reciting prayers. At town gatherings, she spoke little but laughed at the right moments, smiled with the precision of someone who knew exactly how to leave others craving more. The first husband's death. Her story began in earnest with the death of her first husband, Thomas Holloway. They had married young, and their union appeared happy in the early years. Thomas was a carpenter, broad-shouldered and gentle, the kind of man who built cribs before the wedding dress was even finished. But just 2 years into their marriage, Thomas fell gravely ill. Doctors said it was a fever, something that spread through the town one harsh winter. But while others recovered, Thomas withered rapidly, his body weakening as if something inside him had been drained. He died in their home, in the same bed where he and Ruth once shared whispered dreams. Ruth's grief was the kind that made people uncomfortable. She did not wail or collapse dramatically at the funeral. She stood beside the coffin, serene and collected, wearing a black veil that hid her expression. Some admired her strength. Others whispered that she was too calm, too controlled. Sympathy turns into curiosity after Thomas's death. Ruth became the subject of endless kindness. Neighbors brought her casseroles, pies, and flowers. The church collected money to help the poor widow get back on her feet. Even men, married and single alike, offered assistance, visiting her home under the excuse of fixing fences or delivering firewood. She accepted these gestures graciously, never showing the desperation of a woman in need. Instead, she carried herself with an air of dignity, almost queen-like, as though sorrow had elevated her above ordinary women. But behind closed doors, Ruth was not idle. She studied the finances Thomas left behind, carefully organizing bills, insurance policies, and land deeds. The money wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her comfortable, and enough to spark curiosity about how easily she managed to maintain her lifestyle. The rumor mill begins. Time passed, and Hollow Creek moved on. Yet, people never forgot how Ruth seemed to glide through tragedy with unnerving ease. She wore her widowhood like a gown tailored to fit her perfectly, never bitter, never broken, but quietly alluring in her sorrow. That was when the second man entered her life. And though no one knew it then, his fate was already sealed the moment he smiled at her from across the churchyard. It was less than a year after Thomas's burial when Ruth appeared at the Sunday service with a new man by her side. His name was Edward Mallory, a 39-year-old merchant who owned the town's only hardware store. Edward was a widower himself, respectable, known for his generosity and punctuality. He was not wealthy by grand standards, but compared to the average man in Hollow Creek, he was comfortable, secure. The sight of Ruth with Edward startled the congregation. Some pitied her for moving on too quickly. Others whispered that she deserved happiness again after her misfortunes. Edward, charmed beyond reason, claimed that Ruth was a blessing from heaven. He said her calm voice soothed him. Her presence healed his loneliness. Edward Mallory's fate, the marriage was quiet, simple. Ruth wore cream instead of white, explaining softly that she had no desire to overshadow her past. To outsiders, it looked modest, but those who attended said her eyes gleamed when Edward slipped the ring onto her finger. Within 2 years, Edward Mallory was dead. The story was almost too neat. A sudden illness that swept through him like wildfire. He had been healthy, still vigorous enough to stock shelves and manage accounts. But one winter night, after a supper Ruth herself prepared, he fell ill. Violent cramps twisted his body, and within 3 days he was gone. Doctors attributed it to a bacterial infection from spoiled food. An unfortunate accident, they said. Tragic, but not suspicious. Ruth sat by his bedside the entire time, whispering prayers, stroking his hair, feeding him water with a silver spoon. At the funeral, she wore her black veil again, her posture regal, her sorrow silent. By then, Hollow Creek was divided. Some insisted Ruth was cursed, that misfortune followed her like a shadow. Others began to wonder, why did tragedy strike only her husbands? Husband number 3, the farmer. If Edward's death unsettled the town, Ruth's third marriage outright scandalized it. His name was Samuel Price, a farmer 10 years younger than Ruth. Unlike Edward, Samuel was not wealthy, nor refined. He was rugged, with calloused hands and sunburned skin. But what he lacked in polish, he made up for in energy. Witnesses claimed he looked at Ruth like she was the first sunrise he'd ever seen. How did Ruth, elegant and reserved, fall for a man like Samuel? Whispers filled the town. Some said she craved his youth. Others claimed she wanted to prove she could charm any man, no matter his class. But those who knew Ruth best recognized something darker. Samuel owned fertile land, the kind that promised good harvests and steady income. The marriage, predictably, was short. One autumn evening, Samuel went out to repair a section of his fence near the ravine. He never came back. Hours later, his body was discovered at the bottom, his skull shattered, neck broken. The conclusion? An accident. The ground was slippery from rain, and Samuel, though strong, was known to drink. The sheriff closed the case within a week. No foul play suspected, but the people of Hollow Creek whispered otherwise. Why had Ruth insisted Samuel fix the fence that very night, despite the weather? Why had she not gone looking for him herself, waiting instead until a neighbor raised alarm? And why, always why, did Ruth seem more composed than any grieving widow ought to be? Pattern emerges: 3 husbands, 3 funerals, 3 inheritances. By now, Ruth lived more comfortably than most families in town. She had money from Edward's store, land from Samuel, and the house Thomas left behind. Yet she never flaunted her fortune. She dressed modestly, attended church faithfully, and gave donations to the parish. Still, the whispers grew. Children dared each other to walk past her house at night, claiming they saw strange lights flickering through the curtains. Women warned their husbands to keep their distance, and men, though wary, still found themselves glancing at her when she passed, unable to resist her quiet magnetism. Ruth seemed untouchable. Each death, though suspicious, carried just enough plausibility to dismiss. Illness, accident, tragedy, fate. But beneath the surface, a trail of coffins followed her, and Hollow Creek began to wonder how many more would be added before someone finally asked the right questions. Ruth's mask of innocence. If Ruth knew what people whispered, she never showed it. She carried herself as though grief had refined her soul rather than shattered it. She volunteered at church events, taught scripture to children, baked bread for neighbors during hard winters. This was her genius, to cloak herself in virtue so convincingly that even those who doubted her hesitated to accuse her openly. Who would dare question a woman who donated to orphans, who prayed with widows, who fed the poor? Yet behind her eyes lay a glimmer that unsettled those who looked too closely. A glimmer of satisfaction, perhaps even triumph. For Ruth knew something the town had not yet discovered. Her story was only just beginning. Foreshadowing the next deaths by the time Samuel's coffin was lowered into the ground, Hollow Creek was restless. Some said Ruth should leave the town, that too many deaths stained her presence. Others defended her, arguing that no woman could endure such loss without breaking. Ruth, however, showed no signs of leaving. She stood at Samuel's grave, silent as ever, the black veil hiding her expression. When asked how she survived so much grief, she answered with a calm that chilled those who heard it. "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. I am but his humble servant." Few realized that her words carried a double edge, that perhaps Ruth was not merely waiting on God's hand, but playing God herself. By the time Samuel Price's broken body was laid to rest, Ruth Holloway had already begun weaving her next chapter. Hollow Creek might have whispered, but whispers had never stopped Ruth. In fact, they seemed to make her stronger, like the hum of background music that accompanied her carefully orchestrated performances. What the townsfolk didn't know was this: Ruth had grown comfortable in tragedy. With every husband buried, she grew richer, more untouchable, and more skilled at the delicate art of balancing appearances. The town called it bad luck, fate, misfortune. But in truth, Ruth had begun to master something far more deliberate: the quiet science of killing. Husband number 4. The banker. His name was Harold Green, a banker from the neighboring town of Milford. Unlike her previous husbands, Harold was not rugged or simple. He was refined, ambitious, and, most importantly, wealthy. His suits were neatly pressed, his hair always parted, and he carried himself with the kind of pride only money could buy. For Ruth, Harold was not just a husband. He was an opportunity. With his fortune, she could elevate herself beyond Hollow Creek, beyond whispers and rumors, into a life of true power. Their courtship was swift. Harold was drawn to Ruth's mystery, the way her voice lingered like a hymn, the way her green eyes seemed to both comfort and unsettle. He saw in her the sophistication he lacked in his previous wives. She was older than him by a few years, but that only added to her allure. They married in a modest ceremony, Ruth once again in cream rather than white, her veil delicately hiding her faint smile. But Harold did not live long. Within months, he began to complain of stomach pains. At first, they were mild, brushed off as indigestion, but they worsened with alarming speed. He grew weak, nauseous, and pale. Doctors were baffled. His organs seemed to fail without explanation. Ruth, of course, was the devoted wife. She sat at his bedside, spoon-feeding him broth, offering tea, and whispering prayers. No one questioned that every meal, every drink, passed first through her hands. Harold died in his own home, clutching his stomach, sweat drenching his face. The official cause: internal complications, undiagnosed illness. But those who saw the body spoke of something different: an unnatural yellow tint to his skin, the strange burning in his throat before death. In truth, Harold Green had been poisoned. The widow's method. Ruth had learned patience by then. Poison was not a weapon of haste. It was the art of erosion, the slow unraveling of a man's body under her silent supervision. It left no marks of violence, no visible wounds, just sickness, misfortune, a curse. She had studied it quietly, gathering knowledge from books on herbs, household chemicals, and whispered remedies passed among women at the market. Few suspected her of harboring such knowledge, for Ruth wore her virtue like armor. But behind her black-veiled composure, she calculated every dose, every cup, every spoonful. And as Harold's fortune passed into her possession, Ruth's confidence grew. Husband number 5. The businessman. The next man to fall into Ruth's orbit was Richard Alden, a traveling businessman with connections in shipping and trade. Unlike her previous husbands, Richard was adventurous, restless, always speaking of opportunities beyond their small town. He promised Ruth a world outside Hollow Creek, a life on the road, in cities by the sea. She pretended to hesitate. She told him her heart had been broken too many times, that she feared the curse she carried. Richard, romantic fool that he was, swore he would break the cycle, that his love would protect her from fate. They wed in spring. Ruth wore lavender this time, claiming she no longer sought purity but renewal. The townsfolk raised their eyebrows but kept their distance. By now, most regarded her with a mix of fascination and fear. For a time, Ruth seemed happy. She traveled with Richard to ports and towns, her wardrobe expanding, her jewelry sparkling. To outsiders, she looked like a woman finally freed from grief. But Ruth was not built for freedom. She was built for control. And Richard, with his unpredictable business ventures and constant risks, was not the kind of man she could fully command. Control, to Ruth, was survival. And survival demanded sacrifice. The holiday death, it happened during a seaside holiday in Brighton. Richard, always indulgent, had ordered oysters and fine wine. He laughed, boasting of the new contracts he had secured, promising Ruth a future of riches. She smiled, raising her glass, her voice soft as silk. Hours later, Richard collapsed in their rented villa. His throat burned, his stomach twisted. He begged for water, his body convulsing in pain. Ruth knelt beside him, her hands steady, her expression unreadable. She whispered prayers, as always, her lips close to his ear. By morning, Richard Alden was dead. The local physician claimed it was food poisoning, perhaps from the oysters. No further questions were asked. But once again, Ruth returned home with her husband's wealth, her face veiled, her reputation cloaked in tragedy. The community reacts 5 husbands, 5 funerals. By now, Hollow Creek was no longer merely whispering. It was buzzing like a hive. People avoided Ruth on the street, yet couldn't resist glancing at her when she passed. Mothers warned their sons not to get too close. Children whispered tales of the Black Widow who lured men into coffins. The sheriff grew uneasy. He admitted, in private, that no woman could be so unlucky without reason. But suspicion was not proof, and Ruth's hands were too clean, her composure too steady. Each death bore its own explanation. Illness, accident, bad food. Ruth herself never denied the whispers. Instead, she leaned into them. She spoke of curses, of her grief, of her fear that she carried misfortune like a shadow. This vulnerability disarmed many, turning suspicion into pity. But those who looked deeper into her green eyes saw no sorrow, only calculation. Patterns in the coffins by the end of Richard Alden's funeral. A disturbing pattern was undeniable. Thomas, the carpenter, illness. Edward, the merchant, infection. Samuel, the farmer, accident. Harold, the banker, mysterious stomach failure. Richard, the businessman, food poisoning. Different deaths, different stories. Yet every coffin bore Ruth Holloway's invisible fingerprints. And Hollow Creek, whether it admitted it aloud or not, was waiting for the next man to fall. Ruth's reflection at night. Ruth often sat by her window, staring at the lamp flickering in the dark. Her reflection in the glass was not that of a grieving widow but of a queen surveying her kingdom. She did not kill for rage. She did not kill for lust. She killed for power, for the delicious control of knowing that every man who entered her life left in a coffin, and every coffin made her stronger. Her methods had grown more refined, her instincts sharper. Each death fed her hunger, and each inheritance built her empire. By the time the 5th coffin was lowered into the earth, Hollow Creek had grown weary of funerals. Yet, they still came, like clockwork, each one tied to the same woman. Ruth Holloway's reputation was no longer just whispered, it was branded. To the older folk, she was cursed. To the younger ones, she was a legend, the widow of coffins. Every new suitor was treated like a man stepping into a grave, though strangely, that never stopped them. Because Ruth, despite her trail of death, remained irresistible. Husband number 6. The veteran, his name was Captain William Harrow, a decorated war veteran in his early 50s. He had returned from service with a limp, medals pinned to his chest, and a stern face that rarely softened. William was not like Ruth's other husbands. He had seen death, commanded soldiers, buried friends in foreign soil. Most believed that if anyone could resist Ruth's charm, or at least survive it, it would be him. He was too disciplined, too hardened, too experienced. But William Harrow was also lonely. The war had taken more than his strength. It had taken his family, his home, his peace. And when Ruth spoke to him with her gentle, hymn-like voice, he felt a strange warmth he hadn't known in years. They married quietly, without fanfare. By then, even Hollow Creek's gossips were exhausted. The veteran's suspicions, unlike her previous husbands, William did not surrender to Ruth's presence completely. He watched her carefully, observed her habits. He noticed how she always insisted on preparing meals, how she poured his tea herself, how she lingered near the medicine cabinet longer than necessary. And William was no fool. He had seen poison in the war, the way it weakened strong men until their bodies gave up. When his stomach began to ache one evening after supper, suspicion crept into his mind. Unlike the others, he did not ignore it. He began writing a journal. In it, he recorded every strange thing he noticed. The way Ruth measured his food portions with precision. The faint bitterness in his tea. Her calm expression when he winced in pain. His handwriting was shaky, but his words were clear. If I do not survive this house, let it be known that Ruth Holloway is not cursed. She is the curse. The death of William Harrow weeks later, William Harrow was found hanging in the barn. At least that was the official story. Ruth claimed she had gone to fetch him for supper and found him suspended from the beam, rope biting into his neck, his body swaying gently. The sheriff, already wary of Ruth, inspected the scene. Suicide, he concluded reluctantly. War veterans carried burdens no one could see, and the journal, though discovered in his belongings, was dismissed as the ramblings of a paranoid man haunted by trauma. Ruth stood by the coffin, her veil low, her hands folded in perfect composure. She whispered only one sentence to the widow of another veteran standing beside her. War kills long after the battle's end. It was such a pious, tragic thing to say that many wept. Few noticed her faint smile beneath the veil. Husband number 7. The house fire. If William's death left the town uneasy, the next would leave it shaken. Ruth's 7th husband was Joseph Langley, a mill owner in his 40s. He was a practical man, cheerful, generous, and fond of community events. Some believed he married Ruth because he thought he could restore her happiness. Others thought he was simply bewitched like the rest. Their marriage lasted nearly a year, longer than most expected. Joseph adored her, and Ruth played the part of a devoted wife flawlessly. But beneath the veneer of happiness, the same shadow grew. One stormy night, tragedy struck. The Holloway home was engulfed in flames. Neighbors rushed to help, but by the time they arrived, the house was collapsing in on itself. Ruth was found outside, coughing, her nightgown singed. Joseph, however, never made it out. His body was discovered in the charred remains, burned beyond recognition. The fire marshal blamed faulty wiring, but townsfolk whispered darker theories. Why had Ruth escaped unharmed, while Joseph perished inside? Why had she not raised the alarm until the flames were already consuming the roof? And why did the insurance company pay out a handsome sum to Ruth within weeks of the fire? The town turns against her by now. Hollow Creek's patience was gone. It was not just whispers anymore. It was outright accusations muttered in the open. In the market, women refused to serve her. Children spat the word murderess when she walked past. Men muttered that no one would be foolish enough to marry her again. And yet, the strange paradox of Ruth Holloway remained. She was both feared and mesmerizing. Some still pitied her. Others, in spite of themselves, admired her poise, her unshakable calm in the face of death after death. But for the first time, Ruth sensed the shift. Her mask of innocence was cracking. People were not just suspicious now, they were angry. Media attention. It was Joseph Langley's death that caught the attention of the newspapers. A reporter from the city came to Hollow Creek, sniffing around the ashes of the house fire, listening to the townsfolk's stories. Soon, headlines appeared. The widow of Hollow Creek. 7 husbands, 7 funerals. Is Ruth Holloway cursed or a killer? The town, once content with whispers, now had a national spotlight cast upon it. Ruth's name became a dark curiosity. Strangers came to Hollow Creek just to see the widow with their own eyes, to glimpse the woman who seemed to trail coffins wherever she walked. Ruth alone in the shadows in the quiet of her rebuilt home. Ruth stood before her mirror, staring at her reflection. For the first time, she saw not just elegance, but cracks, lines forming at the edges of her eyes, the faintest tremble in her hands. The fire had nearly undone her. William's journal, though dismissed, lingered in her mind like an echo. And now the press circled like vultures, hungry for the truth. But Ruth was not finished. Not yet, because in her mind, one thought burned brighter than the fire that had consumed her home. 8. The number must be 8. And soon her final husband would meet his fate. For months after Joseph Langley's body was reduced to ash and bone, Ruth Holloway lived in a strange half-light. The town eyed her with open suspicion now. Neighbors crossed the street when she approached, mothers pulled children closer, and men avoided her gaze. Yet, as much as Hollow Creek feared her, there was still something magnetic about her presence. She was like a storm cloud, dark, dangerous, but impossible not to look at. And then came the man who would be her last. The young suitor, his name was Daniel Whitmore, only 28 years old. He was new to town, a schoolteacher with a warm smile and the kind of earnest energy that made him popular among his students. Daniel had heard the whispers, of course. It was impossible not to, but when he first met Ruth, he did not see a black widow. He saw a woman of quiet grace, her voice low and soothing, her eyes filled with an almost hypnotic sadness. "You've suffered so much," he told her one evening after church service. "You deserve peace." Ruth lowered her lashes, concealing her faint smile. She had found her 8th. An uneasy courtship, their relationship unsettled Hollow Creek. Daniel was young, full of life, with his whole future ahead of him. Ruth was older, seasoned by tragedy, her beauty sharpened into something almost predatory. Many tried to warn him. The sheriff pulled him aside. Mothers whispered. Students joked nervously that their teacher would soon be in a coffin. But Daniel was stubborn. He believed himself different. He believed Ruth's curse was nothing but cruel gossip. And Ruth played her part with perfection. She wept in his arms, spoke of her longing for love, her fear of being alone forever. She allowed herself to appear fragile, broken, in need of saving. For Daniel, who had always longed to rescue, to protect, this was irresistible. The marriage of unequal halves. Their wedding was small, almost secretive. Many townsfolk refused to attend. Still, Ruth wore another gown of muted color, this time gray silk, and Daniel stood at her side with pride, ignoring the shadows of doubt cast by everyone around them. He was her youngest husband yet, and in his youth, Ruth saw both a challenge and a thrill. The others had been older, wealthier, easier to control. Daniel was strong, vibrant, and suspicious of nothing. But for Ruth, control was everything. Fractures in the facade at first, their marriage seemed harmonious. Daniel adored her, doting on her, speaking openly of building a new life together. But Ruth was not made for harmony. She grew restless when he questioned her habits, why she insisted on handling the cooking, why she grew tense when he tried to pour his own tea, why she locked certain drawers in the kitchen. And Daniel, though kind, was not blind. He noticed the way her eyes sometimes lingered too long on him as he ate, the faintest twitch of a smile when he drank. He began to write letters, never sent, confessing his doubts. "She is everything I ever wanted, and yet, at night when she thinks I'm asleep, she just sits and stares at me, like she's waiting for something." The fatal night, it happened late in autumn, on a night when rain lashed against the windows and thunder rolled through the hills. Daniel had returned home from school, soaked but cheerful, bringing Ruth a book he thought she'd enjoy. She smiled, kissed his cheek, and insisted she would make him tea. He drank it without question, but within minutes his body convulsed. His throat burned, his chest tightened, and he fell to the floor gasping. Ruth knelt beside him, stroking his hair, whispering her familiar prayers. His wide, terrified eyes stared into hers as the life drained from his body. This time, though, something was different, because the neighbors heard. Witnesses in the storm earlier that night, Daniel had invited a colleague, another teacher, to stop by. When he didn't answer the door, the man lingered outside. He claimed later that he heard shouting, coughing, and a crash from within the house. Another neighbor, peering through a rain-streaked window, swore she saw Ruth standing over Daniel's body with a strange calmness, not the panic of a wife losing her husband. When the sheriff arrived, summoned quickly by alarmed townsfolk, he found Daniel dead on the floor, Ruth seated beside him with dry eyes and folded hands. This time, Hollow Creek did not whisper. It screamed. Breaking the cycle of silence, the sheriff, who had buried his doubts for too long, finally acted. Daniel's body was taken for examination, and unlike the previous deaths, the town demanded answers. The physician, using more modern methods than years prior, found traces in Daniel's stomach that pointed not to illness or accident, but to deliberate poisoning. With that single revelation, the cycle broke. 7 deaths that had been written off as bad luck or curses were now dragged into the light. The sheriff ordered that Ruth be taken into custody, her calm composure faltering for the first time as the townsfolk jeered and spat at her in the street. Ruth's final performance, even as she was led away, Ruth tried to perform her part. She wept, claimed innocence, spoke of persecution, insisted that her heart was cursed, not her hands. She begged the sheriff to see reason, to pity her, to believe that Daniel's death was an accident. But her voice, once honey-smooth, now rang hollow. Too many coffins, too many patterns, too much proof. The Black Widow had finally been caught in her own web. Closing of a chapter. Daniel Whitmore was laid to rest with the whole town in mourning. For once, Ruth was not the grieving widow at the graveside. She was behind iron bars, her veil stripped away, her beauty exposed to the cold light of truth. The storm that had carried Daniel Whitmore to his grave did not pass with his burial. It lingered in Hollow Creek. Not in the skies, but in the streets, in the hearts of the people. For years, the town had whispered, doubted, and wondered. Now those doubts were no longer shadows. They were sharpened into accusations, backed by the one thing Ruth Holloway had always evaded: evidence. The sheriff's regret. Sheriff Abram Cole had been a man of law for 30 years. He had arrested thieves, drunks, and murderers before, but never had he felt such a heavy weight of regret. He had watched Ruth bury husband after husband, had written off each death as misfortune, accident, or the hand of God. But now, with Daniel's death revealed as poisoning, Cole felt complicit in every grave she had left behind. "I should have seen it," he muttered to his deputy as they looked over Daniel's autopsy report. "I should have stopped her years ago." The deputy said nothing. There was no comfort to give. Exhumations begin at first. The idea seemed grotesque. Digging up the bodies of Ruth's past husbands, disturbing graves that had long settled into silence. But the town demanded it. And so, under court order, the coffins of Thomas Holloway, Edward Barnes, Henry Fletcher, Charles Vane, Samuel Quinn, William Harrow, and Joseph Langley were exhumed. The work was grim. Rain-soaked earth gave way to damp coffins, wood swollen and fragile. Families protested, some wept, but the law pressed forward. Inside, forensic examination, limited though it was in the late 19th century, revealed troubling consistencies. Thomas Holloway, stomach lining burned, consistent with ingestion of toxins. Edward Barnes, organs unusually degraded, suspected poison. Henry Fletcher, signs of asphyxiation not matching natural causes. Charles Vane, dosage of opiates far above medical recommendation. Samuel Quinn, rare substance detected in his tea leaves kept as a keepsake. William Harrow, though ruled suicide, marks on his neck suggested the rope was tightened after death. Joseph Langley, fire determined to have originated unnaturally, accelerant traces in the ash. Piece by piece, the puzzle that had once looked like coincidence revealed itself as something else. a deliberate, methodical pattern of death. The town's horror Hollow Creek, long accustomed to whispering in shadows, now found itself screaming in horror. Church sermons condemned the killer widow. Mothers warned their sons never to look twice at a woman with widow's eyes. The local newspaper, once cautious, now printed in bold ink, 8 husbands, 8 deaths. Hollow Creek's widow faces justice. Strangers flocked to town. Reporters, photographers, and even thrill-seekers arrived to see the woman who had buried nearly a dozen men with such uncanny ease. For Hollow Creek, there was no peace. Their little town had become a spectacle. Ruth's defense from her cell, Ruth remained composed. She wore her black gowns even behind bars, her auburn hair pinned neatly, her hands folded as though still presiding over a funeral. When questioned, she played her role with the same perfection she had wielded for decades. "My husbands were ill," she insisted. "Each one taken by fate. How could I have stopped it? How could I bear such loss?" She wept when it suited her, spoke softly when confronted, and clung to her identity as a victim of cruel circumstance. But the evidence was against her. The poison, the fire, the inconsistencies, and worst of all, the journal of William Harrow, brought back to light and now viewed not as paranoia, but prophecy. Letters unearthed in the midst of the investigation, more damning discoveries surfaced. Daniel Whitmore's unsent letters were found in his desk drawer. In them, he wrote of Ruth's unsettling behavior, of his growing fear. "She watches me, not with love, but with hunger. I feel as though my life is being measured, day by day, waiting for some moment I cannot name." Combined with William Harrow's journal, these writings painted a chilling picture. Men who had lived under her roof long enough began to sense the truth, and all of them died before they could act. Public frenzy. The trial had not yet begun, but the verdict was already decided in the public's eyes. Ruth Holloway was guilty. Crowds gathered outside the jailhouse, shouting, throwing stones, demanding her execution. Yet still, Ruth maintained her poise. When reporters were allowed to interview her, she tilted her head gracefully, smiled faintly, and said, "It is a cruel thing to be cursed by death. You would not understand unless it followed you as it follows me." The words, printed in newspapers, only inflamed the public more. To them, this was not the voice of a victim, but of a manipulator trying to twist her crimes into poetry. The killer widow's mask slips one evening. A young reporter claimed to have overheard Ruth speaking to herself in the dark of her cell. She did not weep or pray. Instead, she whispered, "8. At last, the circle is complete." When he published the account, many dismissed it as sensationalism. But for those who had long suspected her, the words rang true. Ruth had not mourned her husbands. She had collected them. The sheriff's vigil, Sheriff Cole, visited Ruth one last time before the trial. He stood outside her bars, staring at the woman who had fooled him for decades. "You could have stopped," he said, his voice heavy. "You could have lived with 1, 2, even 3, but you didn't stop." Ruth looked up at him, her green eyes glittering in the lamplight. "Do you think hunger stops?" she asked softly. "Do you think the spider weaves only once?" The sheriff walked away without another word. Building the case, the prosecutors assembled their argument piece by piece, using every husband's death as a stepping stone. Forensics, journals, letters, insurance records, and eyewitness testimony formed a tapestry of murder. The defense argued illness, accident, coincidence. They tried to paint Ruth as a grieving widow persecuted by superstition. But the truth was too heavy now, too loud to be ignored. The stage is set by winter. The trial was ready to begin. Hollow Creek transformed into a stage for one of the most sensational murder cases of the century. Reporters arrived in droves, ink-stained fingers ready to capture every expression, every whispered word. And Ruth Holloway, once the silent widow in black, would finally stand in the open. Her charm and composure tested not in a parlor, not at a graveside, but in the eyes of the law. The courthouse of Hollow Creek had never seen such a crowd. On the morning of January 14, 1893, the steps were packed with townsfolk, reporters, and gawkers from neighboring counties. Some came seeking justice, others spectacle. But all eyes were fixed on one figure. Ruth Holloway, the woman who had buried 8 husbands and now stood accused of killing them all. The widow's entrance when Ruth was brought into the courtroom, silence fell. She wore black silk once more, as if in perpetual mourning. Her auburn hair was neatly coiled, her gloved hands folded. She did not look like a monster. She looked like a grieving lady of society, dignified even in chains. Reporters scribbled furiously. Headlines the next day would read, "Killer widow appears as a lady in mourning. Is she a victim or a murderess?" The charges, the indictment was read aloud. Murder in the first degree. Daniel Whitmore. Suspected murder by poisoning. Thomas Holloway, Edward Barnes, Henry Fletcher, Charles Vane, Samuel Quinn. Suspected staged accident. William Harrow, Joseph Langley. Though the state pursued primarily the charge of Daniel Whitmore's murder, bolstered by forensic evidence, they laid out the others to establish pattern and intent. 8 names, 8 graves, 8 accusations. The prosecution's opening District Attorney Franklin Keene addressed the jury with grim clarity. "Ladies and gentlemen, you will hear of men who died too soon, men who trusted the wrong woman, men whose final moments were stolen from them. You will see the pattern of poison, of fire, of strangulation, of false tears. You will hear from witnesses who doubted, from experts who examined, from journals and letters that speak from the grave. And when you put it all together, you will see what Hollow Creek has whispered for years. Ruth Holloway is not cursed by death. She is the hand that brings it." The defense's strategy, her lawyer, Mr. Ambrose Price, was smooth, articulate, and unyielding. He painted Ruth as a victim of cruel superstition, persecuted by gossip. "Yes, she lost 8 husbands," Price admitted. "A tragedy, yes, but tragedy is not crime. These men died of illness, of accident, of despair. Shall we now condemn a woman for the grief that life has handed her? Shall we let whispers condemn her instead of proof?" He pointed to Ruth, her eyes glistening with carefully timed tears. "She is not a killer. She is a widow, and every accusation against her is built on fear, not fact." Witness testimonies. The trial stretched on for weeks. Witness after witness was called to the stand. Physician Dr. Alcott testified to the chemical traces in Daniel Whitmore's body. Clear signs of deliberate poisoning. Neighbors spoke of hearing Daniel's cries that stormy night, of seeing Ruth calm as death lingered in her home. Teachers from Daniel's school produced his unsent letters, describing his fear of his wife. The deputy coroner presented findings from the exhumations, consistent toxins across multiple husbands. William Harrow's journal was read aloud, detailing his growing suspicion that Ruth meant to kill him. Each testimony cut through Ruth's defense like a blade. The widow's performance, yet Ruth herself was no passive figure. When she took the stand, she wept freely. She spoke of love, of loss, of the cruelty of being misunderstood. "I loved Daniel," she said, her voice breaking. "He was the last light in my life. Do you think I wanted him gone? Do you think I have not suffered enough?" Some in the gallery wept with her. Even a juror was seen dabbing his eyes. For a moment, her spell seemed to work once again. But then came the cross-examination. The prosecution's trapped District Attorney Keene leaned forward, his voice steady but sharp. "Mrs. Holloway, how do you explain the poison in your husband's body?" "I do not know," Ruth whispered. "And the poison found in your kitchen drawer? It was for pests, not for him. And the letters, the journals, the consistent patterns of death across every man you married. Are we to believe all the world conspires against you?" Her hands trembled. Her mask slipped, just for a moment. Keene pressed harder. "Or is it simpler, Mrs. Holloway, that you killed them all?" Silence. The courtroom held its breath. Ruth stared back, eyes glinting, lips tight. And for that heartbeat of stillness, many swore they saw the truth in her face. Public frenzy newspapers exploded with coverage. Some headlines declared her a cold-blooded murderer. Others called her a tragic woman scapegoated by fear. But among the people of Hollow Creek, there was little doubt. They had buried too many husbands, watched too many funerals. They had whispered long enough. The killer widow was guilty. The jury's decision after weeks of testimony. The jury retired for deliberation. The town waited in agony, some praying, others pacing the courthouse steps. Hours later, the verdict was read. We, the jury, find the defendant, Ruth Holloway, guilty of murder in the first degree. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered, others gasped. Ruth did not flinch. She stood tall, her black silk unmoving, her expression unreadable. Sentencing, the judge's voice echoed through the chamber. Ruth Holloway, you are hereby sentenced to death by hanging. Gasps filled the room. The Black Widow's charm had failed at last. Still, Ruth remained composed. She inclined her head, as if acknowledging the inevitable. But then, with a faint smile, she whispered, 8. It was always meant to be 8. The words sent a chill rippling through the gallery. Aftermath of the trial, the newspapers christened it the trial of the century. Her story spread far beyond Hollow Creek, into cities and across states. Some called her the most dangerous woman in America. Others romanticized her as a tragic Gothic figure. But in the town where it all began, the verdict was final. Ruth Holloway would hang. Closing the courtroom curtain as she was led away in shackles, Ruth paused just once, turning her gaze toward the gallery. Her eyes met the sheriff's. Do you see now? She said softly. They were mine. All of them. Sheriff Cole clenched his jaw. For the rest of his life, he would hear those words in his sleep. The trial was over. But the legacy of Ruth Holloway had only just begun. The trial was over, the sentence delivered. Yet Hollow Creek was not finished with Ruth Holloway. In some ways, her trial had been only the beginning. For in the weeks, months, and years that followed, her name grew into something larger than herself. Something that haunted not just the town, but the imagination of an entire nation. The widow in prison Ruth was confined to the women's ward of the state penitentiary. Unlike the other prisoners, broken women with sunken eyes and weary shoulders, Ruth carried herself with the same poise she had displayed in court. She arranged her hair each morning. She stitched her black gowns from prison cloth. She walked the halls not as a condemned woman, but as though she still presided over some invisible parlor, some grand funeral no one else could see. Guards whispered that she never begged, never wept. Instead, she wrote. Pages upon pages of neat handwriting filled her cell. Some were prayers, others love letters, to whom no one knew. A few read like confessions, though cryptic and laced with riddles. 8 was the circle, 8 was the vow, and 8 was fulfilled. The prison warden kept her writings locked away, fearful of what fascination they might stir. Public obsession while Ruth waited for her execution date. The world outside fed on her legend. Newspapers ran serialized accounts of her life. Pamphlets were printed. The Black Widow of Hollow Creek. 8 husbands dead. The curse or the killer? Some treated her as a monster. Others romanticized her, calling her a femme fatale punished for wielding power in a man's world. A theater troupe in Chicago even staged a play inspired by her story, with a raven-haired actress playing the widow in black to packed audiences. Hollow Creek itself became a morbid destination. Travelers came to walk past her house, to see the graves of her husbands, to touch the courthouse steps where she was sentenced. The town profited from the notoriety, though its people spoke of her name only in hushed tones. Final appeals, her lawyer, Ambrose Price, filed appeal after appeal. He argued insufficient evidence, unreliable forensic methods, prejudice from the press. But each was denied. The courts had spoken. By the summer of 1894, her execution date was set. September 21st. The gallows were to be built in Hollow Creek itself, a decision that horrified some and thrilled others. For the town, it was both justice and spectacle. The sheriffs visit Sheriff Cole, who had carried the guilt of every overlooked death, visited Ruth one last time. You'll be gone soon, he said. But the questions won't die with you. Why did you do it? Ruth smiled faintly, her green eyes catching the lamplight. Why does the spider weave? She whispered. Because it must. Cole shook his head, unsettled as ever. You could have stopped at 1 or 2. Her smile grew sharper. 1 would have been lonely. 2 would have been coincidence. But 8 was perfection. The sheriff left her cell that night and never returned. The night before, on the eve of her execution, the prison chaplain visited to offer her comfort. She accepted his prayers with bowed head, but when he asked if she wished to confess, she looked up with calm certainty. "I have nothing to confess," she said. "They were mine, and they will remain mine, even as the rope takes me." That night, guards reported hearing her humming softly in her cell. A lullaby, they thought, though no one could name the tune. The execution at dawn. The town gathered. Hundreds crowded the square where the gallows stood. Some carried Bibles, others carried jeers. Reporters filled notebooks. Children were hoisted on shoulders to see. When Ruth was led out, silence fell again. She wore black still, her gown neatly arranged, her hair pinned as if for a final portrait. She walked with steady steps, unflinching, her gaze fixed not on the crowd but on the horizon. The hangman read her sentence. "Ruth Holloway, for the crime of murder in the 1st degree, you are sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. May God have mercy on your soul." Asked for final words, Ruth lifted her chin. "They were mine," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the hushed square. "And no rope can take them from me." The trapdoor fell, and Hollow Creek's most infamous widow swung into history. Aftermath, the crowd dispersed, some in relief, others disappointed that death had come so quickly. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave beyond the prison walls, denied the dignity of Hollow Creek Cemetery. Yet within weeks, stories spread of flowers mysteriously appearing at the site, of strangers making pilgrimages to the spot. Some claimed her ghost lingered in Hollow Creek, seen near the graves of her husbands, or walking the edge of the river where Daniel had cried out his last. The legend grows in the years that followed. Ruth Holloway became more legend than woman. Folklore painted her as a witch who had bargained with the devil. Literature transformed her into a Gothic heroine, cursed to love and kill in equal measure. True crime pamphlets made her a cautionary tale, warning men of deceptive beauty. Historians debated whether she had truly killed them all, or whether some of the deaths had been accidents woven into a darker narrative. But the truth, tangled though it was, could not be undone. 8 men had died, and 1 woman had stood at the center of it all. Hollow Creek's burden for the town itself, Ruth's shadow never lifted. Tourists continued to come, seeking morbid thrills. The house where she had lived was eventually abandoned, said to be haunted. Children dared each other to peek through its broken windows, swearing they saw her standing at the top of the stairs, still in black. The graves of her husbands became shrines of fear and fascination. Locals avoided them at night. Outsiders left notes, trinkets, even locks of hair, tokens of some strange devotion. Hollow Creek would forever be known not for its river, not for its mills, but for its widow. The spider's web. Years later, a historian studying her case unearthed a chilling note among her prison writings. It was short, almost like a poem. 8 strands in the web, 8 knots in the rope, 8 names in the earth, and I, their widow whole. Whether she wrote it in madness or clarity, no one could say. But it captured what the town had always feared, that Ruth Holloway had not been cursed by death. She had courted it, claimed it, and cherished it. Final reflection: Ruth Holloway died as she lived, in black silk, calm, and unrepentant. Her story did not end with her body swinging from the gallows. It lived on in every whispered tale, every chilling headline, every ghost story told on Hollow Creek's dark nights. E1.